Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Sanjana Rajagopal. She is a PhD student in philosophy, and she is currently beginning her dissertation and doing lots of work within all different types of philosophy, but focused on Hannah Arendt and some of the continental philosophers. And I wanted to get her on the podcast to talk about some of her work for some of these people, especially Hannah Arendt and some of her ideas. And so this was a great conversation where we were able to talk about their ideas, but then also philosophy a little bit more generally as well. So this first part of this conversation, we talk about her background in philosophy and her experiences as a woman in philosophy, and more specifically a Hindu woman within philosophy, and some of the experiences that she's had, negative and positive, about that, and some of the challenges and some of the really good moments. And so it was a really nice perspective to hear about how she navigates the world of philosophy, and it's just really refreshing and quite nice. We also get into the differences of continental and analytic philosophy, and then we talk about Heidegger a lot, and it's a good portion of the conversation about Heidegger's main philosophical concepts. We talked about death and idle talk. We talked about his idea of Dasein and being, thrownness and worldhood, and then, spatiality, de-severance, and directionality. Heidegger is a really tough person to read and get, and mostly because, obviously it's German to English translation for folks in the United States or English-speaking countries. But, he also was creating words to try to explain experience. And so there's just not enough words that are there that makes sense for the experience he's trying to explain. So that's why we talk a lot about that. And these words are weird, but they're a way of trying to explain experience, and we get at a lot of those. And then we talk about Hannah Arendt, who, just kind of her background in general, and then we talk about her different ideas. Talk about her tripart, concept of labor, work, and action. We talk about her ideas of vita activa and vita contemplative. We talk about her on reading and understanding of Kant's ideas on judgment. We talk about her political theory and some of the misuse. And then we also talk about her work of the banality of evil, Eichmann's trial in the 60s. And then towards the end, we talk about Hannah Arendt's complicated relationship with Heidegger, both personally and professionally. Again, this conversation was great. I feel that people should read and hear and understand more about these two thinkers, lots of thinkers, but really these two influential thinkers. And so I was really happy to have a really nice conversation with her about this stuff. And she's quite smart, quite bright, and she was really just wonderful to talk to and engage with on these philosophical ideas. And so now I bring you Sanjana Rajagopal. I am here with Sanjana Rajagopal. What's going on?
Hey, I just finished my next to last semester of my PhD.
Yeah. Tell us where you're studying at and how you got involved into it, and kind of what your aims are and what you hope to accomplish. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So I was an undergrad at Fordham, actually, where I'm doing the PhD, but I was at their Lincoln campus in Manhattan, and I was so they actually require every student to take 2 philosophy courses. I actually ended up putting off my first philosophy class for a really long time. I didn't think I would like it at all. So every semester when I had to do course selection, I just kept putting it off. And finally, I ended up taking it in 2016 with a wonderful professor named Amy Seymour. And I really liked the way that she taught it. And I really liked the kind of questions that she was asking, and all the kind of things we explored in that class. So I got really into it. And I would start reading things outside of class, and I would take them to her office hours. And that's kind of how I got into it. Like, she started to mentor me. She would take me to conferences or encourage me.
That's nice. Yeah. What was the class?
It was just the intro level class. It was called the Philosophy of Human Nature. So it's just like a generic name for the course that everyone has to take. And different professors will treat it differently. So yeah, the different things are.
So this is an undergrad, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then you said there were 2 classes, right? So what was the second one?
Right. So the second one is philosophical ethics. So everyone has to take that as well. But I mean, in terms of formative classes, I would say probably this one with Amy. And then I took a class with Professor named Karina Geschwantner. And that was my first like upper level kind of philosophy class. And that was on Being in Time. So.
Oh, cool. Very cool. So then you kind of get the itch for philosophy. And so then you decided to take the plunge and get a PhD in philosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah. I got really into it. I was really inspired by this professor. I really kind of liked her life path, or the way that she was doing things. So I wanted to be in that kind of position myself as like a teacher, also doing the research. And then I spent one summer, I went to MIT for, they had like a summer diversity institute, where they bring in different philosophy undergrads and encourage them basically to apply to grad school in philosophy. That was really great. I mean, I got to meet really cool people like Sally Haslanger and.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's nice.
That's great. Yeah. So, okay. So tell me again, let's just stay here for a minute about philosophy, and then you can, tell me a little bit about yourself more personally, but
yeah.
So I think, but maybe for some people it may be like, well, why would you get a PhD in philosophy? Like, how can you use that in the real world? And why would you spend that time doing that, aside from, just as an interest or things like that? And so for you, what's like the, I guess the motivating factor, and what do you hope to, I guess, use it, when you're done?
I think, I mean, this is probably going to sound kind of cliche, but I feel like since I was young, I had this kind of interest in just questioning things. So that's kind of where it comes from. But I'm not sure that I necessarily want to end up staying in academia. I mean, if I can, that'll be wonderful. I would love to be a professor. But given the job market, I know that that's not necessarily going to be everyone's kind of path. But I know that there's other kinds of ways that you can use philosophy. I would love to work in a museum or teach high schoolers, or basically anything where I can kind of, I don't know, help people or think through ideas or do some kind of like original creative work. Yeah.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think that's encouraging to hear. I mean, I think because, when you're in school, there's usually a lot of, I guess you can say, forces that are, pulling you one way. You got to, obviously there's the coursework and dissertation, and then there's, certain extracurriculars you have to do. And sometimes it can be very difficult when you're in the midst of it to kind of take it all in and enjoy learning the content. But that's really encouraging to hear that you want to try to, teach others, do original content, in some ways, not give back, but try to be very instructive and in good ways for people. That's really encouraging to hear, especially for something like philosophy.
Yeah, really like, I think going into, this was my first semester of teaching, and I was really worried about it over the summer. I was thinking like, I'm not going to be good at this, and this is going to be really hard. I'm a kind of an awkward person. I don't know. Like, I don't know if this is going to work. But I ended up really liking it. I think there's a kind of way in which I actually like the teaching even more than just the research. I like being able to hear other people's opinions on things, talk about things for the first time.
Yeah, it's cool to see when people are into it, or they're coming at it. Students are coming at it with an interest, or sometimes even when they don't, right? I got to take this stupid class, and then they kind of evolve over the semester and everything. So I remember the first time I taught. It was really cool at the end of it. The first semester when I taught a couple years ago, where I was like, yeah, I really like doing this. This is a lot of fun. Mostly, the grading sucks. I don't like grading at all. It sucks. But
In college, in high school, or
no, I teach at the graduate level. So I teach master's level and doctorate students, both in one is in master's in counseling and one is doctorate in psychology.
okay.
So I've taught at two different schools, and yeah, it's that's a different level of teaching, and it's interesting, but I really enjoy it. I enjoy teaching because everything what you just said is right. Is there's something about things, the content, I think, better when you have to teach it, because
Yeah.
you kind of have to like not have an answer for everything, but you have to like know how to explain it.
Yeah.
And philosophy has some abstract concepts. So if you can explain that pretty well, you're doing something right. So yeah, I know you said you enjoyed it, but what was your, I guess, a little bit more about your experience teaching this semester?
Yeah, so like I said, everyone at Fordham has to take this philosophy of human nature course, and 60% of it, like by the rule, has to be devoted to basically Aquinas, Aristotle, Descartes. I think Plato might be the fourth, and I think you have a choice of teaching Augustine, which I didn't do. But yeah, so you have 60% of the course is devoted to those, and you can pick basically which, like how much of each author you want to read, or like which selections from Aristotle you want to teach, or whatever. So you have that kind of like freedom. But then the remaining 40% is basically up to you. And
Cool.
you can be teaching anything you want. I had a huge focus on Arendt this semester, as would be kind of expected. And yeah, I thought it was really fun. My students had a lot of really cool insights. Like, these are first year students, but they're picking up on really hard kind of, like, I had them read parts of Being in Time, and I was really impressed
Yeah.
by their ability to make connections between the Heidegger and the Arendt, and like things we'd read earlier in the semester with the Plato, so
There's a type of, this is kind of true, I think, in a lot of disciplines. It's true a little bit in psychology. It's definitely true in art history. It's true of history, I think, in general, but in philosophy in particular, I find that philosophy has this type of like, everything's kind of like a hyperlink, right? Where like everybody builds on the next guy or girl. And it's just like, okay, this person said this, then this person came after him, and then, said it was bullshit and said, we need to do it this way, or they really love this person, they built on it even better, stuff like that. And then you can just do it kind of in epochs, right? So it's like, okay, this period has these, thinkers, the skeptics or whatever. And then you go forward and you have the next group of folks, you have the phenomenologists, the postmodernists, they all kind of like build off of each other. So that's also kind of cool to see, especially I think probably maybe for your students, where it's like, oh, we learn about, allegory of the cave, and we learn about the duality. And then, then we hit Aristotle, and it's like, oh, okay. And then, then you hit everyone else after that. And you start to just see how everything kind of builds off of it into modern 20th century philosophy, which is interesting, especially for Heidegger and Nietzsche, who they both had a kind of a, love and adoration for the Greeks and Greek philosophy, including the pre-Socratic. So there's a lot of that kind of, I guess you could say, a reimagining or a renaissance to that kind of way of thinking, that they're bringing it into their 20th century thought, which is really interesting too. So anyways, so that's really cool that they were able to do that. So you talked about Hannah Arendt, and then did you talk about anybody else, or just her on the second half of the class?
We did. I tried to make it a kind of like wide selection of different people. We did. We did Hannah Arendt. We did Eichmann in Jerusalem, and then we did a section on origins of totalitarianism. And then we also, earlier in the semester, I had them read some parts of The Human Condition, but that was because Aristotle. So I thought it would be a good connection to get in parts of the politics. Since we're not allowed to teach the Nicomachean ethics in this course, that's that has to be for the philosophical ethics course.
Sure.
So yeah, but aside from Arendt, we did Heidegger, like I said. We did Aim Césaire on discourse on colonialism.
Oh, that's cool.
That was really interesting. We did that election week actually, and it's that was really an interesting choice.
I'm sure it was. Yeah, I think everybody should read, what is it, 60, 70 pages, 80 pages, somewhere around there.
Yeah,
Everyone should read the introduction to Being in Time. I feel it's dense, it's a lot. He's laying the groundwork, but especially those last 20 pages. It's just really good for like the whole, it is sort of, in my view, the cliff notes of his whole work of Being in Time. It's like here's the annotated version of everything I'm going to talk about. And it's really good. I mean, obviously he expands on different parts of it later in the book, but I think if everyone read that, they'd be sharper and wiser and better thinkers. Okay, before we get into some of the content of some of the thinkers, you mentioned you did a program or such at MIT for you said diversity or minority students. What was it again?
Okay, so it's called a Pixie, let me think what that stands for. I think it's oh man, I really should know. It's I should probably look this up actually. I read
it's okay
about it, but I don't remember what exactly it stands for. Let's see, Pixie philosophy. Okay, Philosophy in an Inclusive Key Summer Institute.
Okay.
And so this is not just something they do at MIT. They also have them at UCSD, but I think that's a different one. That's like just for women. And then they have another one, I think, in Colorado, which is like for students who are into logic. But this one specifically was just inviting all kinds of different minority students to basically apply to stay at MIT for a week and have different philosophers come in from the Boston area and other schools to kind of like give us lectures from their own research, and then also give us advice about how to apply about grad school in general, and just how to like navigate the discipline as someone who isn't white, basically, or is part of some minority group or whatever. Yeah.
And so you saw that experience favorably. It sounds like it was a really nice experience.
Great. It's like all expenses are paid, so you get.
That's nice.
Yeah, they like flew out some people. It was like international too, so they flew out girls from Libya even.
Oh wow!
If I'm not wrong. Yeah, and so then we just got to stay in the dorms at MIT for a week. And they gave us food. They took us out for ice cream. It was a fun time, and I'm still friends with a lot of those people. So
that's really nice. Yeah, that's really, really cool. I think you must have heard of this. I mean, it came out this year. It's the title of the book is The Philosopher Queens. I'm sure you've heard of this.
Yes, yeah, Rebecca Buxton, right?
Yeah, and Lisa. Oh boy, I'm blanking on her last name.
Lisa Whiting, maybe?
Whiting, that sounds right. Okay. And they basically, I think they wrote a chapter in each, but they basically took, I think it's 20 female philosophers. Hannah Arendt is in there. Simone de Beauvoir is in there. Iris Murdoch. It's kind of the more commonly known female philosophers, but then there's some lesser known philosophers, and it was pretty cool. I did this cool thing where I read a chapter of it with my daughter,
cool.
Which was cool, and then we talk about it and talk about their ideas, and but it was really cool to really see different. I knew maybe about half, and so it was cool hearing all their thought, and just small short essays, essentially 5, 6, 7 pages about basically kind of small biography and then their major thought and stuff, and it was really cool. So I bring that up because so you're a woman and you're in philosophy. It's predominantly I guess historically, and still, a lot of dudes for whatever reason, right? I think I think sometimes it's interesting.
The only woman in my cohort when I came in.
The only woman, really?
Only woman, yeah.
Oh,
So,
wow.
they picked 7 people every year. They try to pick about 7, 8 people,
Hmm.
and I was the only woman in mine. And
Wow.
next year's only had 2, so it wasn't.
Wow. And then you identify as I'm not. Where's your either? Were you born here or you were born?
I was born here, yeah, but my
Okay,
parents were from India, so
from India. Okay,
yeah.
and so you identify as Hindu. Is this correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I only bring it up because we mentioned the piece that you wrote, and so maybe we can begin talking about that. But I guess how is for yourself as a woman and a Hindu woman, you know, what that's there's you can tell me what you think about this. I think that there's who you are as a person, right?
Yeah.
Who you are as an individual, right? There's only one of you, and you're going to have your own thoughts and ideas and feelings. But I do think that there is there's a lot of value and a lot of importance in understanding, like, hey, my background or my culture, or different parts of how I identify also come into play, and they also play a role into, how you see the world, how you see people. And so, tell us a little bit, as much as you want, as much as you feel comfortable with, tell us about uh, some of that, and both on, I guess, being a woman studying philosophy, knowing that you're only one, if the only one in your cohort, and then also being a Hindu woman as well. That's always, something you don't see every day. So I'm very curious for that perspective as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with the kind of question of being a woman.
Sure.
That I think during my major, I think when I was in undergrad, I think there were more kind of women. So, and I was surrounded by women. I had my mentors were both women. So I was, yeah, I guess there was more of a kind of female presence. And then starting grad school, I was kind of like really shocked when I initially got this email that I'm kind of going to be the only woman in my cohort. And I guess maybe it's my personality, or I don't know. Like before that, I hadn't really had many male friends. And so I was kind of like worried, like, am I going to be able to be friends with people? Like, is this going to be like awkward or something? But it ended up being fine. I really liked my cohort. We got along really well. But sometimes I felt like it would have been nice to have more like of a female presence. There are other women in the department who are like older. They might be in their 4th or 5th years when I was in my 1st year.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of them I became friends with. But on the whole, yeah, I kind of felt at times that it would have been nice to have someone kind of like knowing what it felt like in the experience with me.
Mm-hmm.
But
Tell me again, just your experience. I mean, do you see any difference, or do you see any, or do you just see it very similar, or do you see it just in terms of just kind of how individuals are and their temperament or personality about the whole kind of gender kind of split there, in terms of, like, you're the only woman in your cohort? Did it feel like, in terms of I don't know, with a bunch of dudes, there's a lot of groupthink, they had a lot of similar thoughts, or was just everybody kind of having their own individual ways of approaching things and looking at things, and you were just another individual? Or did you ever notice any of that stuff in class, or when you're working on things, or
I
how do you
don't
see it?
think so in class. So I think in class, like it might not have been as maybe pronounced. I think for me, the difficulty was kind of more of the social element.
Hmm.
Um, so I wasn't kind of used to like these dudes just going out to get beers at like Clinton Hall. Like initially that was like kind of, I don't know, like I want to say anxiety inducing, because that's like maybe too strong, but like I don't know, that I didn't feel that I was the type of personality who would fit into that. But
Mhm.
after a while, I think I kind of started to get into it more.
Yeah.
Yeah, for a while I felt like maybe I wasn't going to be able to um, talk with them about the same kinds of things, or
Hmm.
connect with them on, like, I mean, I guess I talk to my female friends about very different things than I might talk to my male friends about.
Sure.
So yeah.
But so there was, I guess, an element of that, but it sounds like everybody was nice. And do you adjust it, and do you like your cohort, which you've said?
I feel like my cohort, I mean, Yeah, I would say that I think the woman problem was a little less for me than the kind of religious issue.
Hmm.
That kind of became an issue for me at certain points in my program.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. So tell us about that, I guess. So is it in terms of identifying as Hindu? Is your religion again? Is strictly cultural, or is it something that you're very seriously practicing, or how does it occupy, I guess, your life on a regular basis? I guess.
I guess I'm kind of like a weird Hindu. I don't know if that's yeah. I practice it in the sense that I do believe in God. And if my family goes to temple or does like kind of any cultural practices or rituals or anything like that, I'll join in with them.
Mhm.
And I believe it. Um, but at the same time, I'm not like, I guess, very actively practicing where I've like read all the scriptures or like I'm going to temple every day or even praying every day or something like that.
Hmm.
But yeah,
How does that, having it sounds like at least you're kind of a nominal Hindu, right? Like I believe in some of the doctrines. There's certain practices or certain temples or maybe the familial element. But right, maybe you're not super into it, super religious. But even at best at a nominal level, being a cultural and somewhat practicing Hindu, how did that impact, studying philosophy and being, I'm assuming Fordham is a liberal school. How did that just impact? I'm sure people, I would assume, are, respectful and receiving, but what did you find that was the disconnect, if there's any, or connections, or how was that experience? Because you were saying that was a little bit more of uh, uh, somewhat of a disconnect than the gender thing.
definitely. Yeah. So in undergrad, actually, I got into philosophy because my professor was really into philosophy of religion. Uh,
Mm,
and so I got into philosophy reading works of these like big name Christian philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen and Alvin Plantinga. Uh,
hmm.
and so, yeah, they're very kind of like mainstream working this like Christian problem of evil or I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not, you can't really say Christian problem of evil, but yeah, this kind of like Christian framework for understanding things like the problem of evil or free will or these other kinds of things. And so I was really fine with that in the beginning. I think for a while I wasn't really, it's not like I had a problem with it or anything. And I was definitely really interested in it.
Hmm.
But I think more and more I started to feel this kind of disconnect that I'm kind of studying more about this religion that I'm not even a part of. Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm kind of at a disconnect from my own religion. And then I started to feel more so. I think in graduate school, it became a bit more pronounced because most of my cohort ended up being very like religious and practicing, some conservatives as well. And so that
Hmm.
kind of brings that into the mix of politics. But yeah, I sometimes I would get these like exclusionary comments or things like that that made it a bit more difficult, or made me feel like maybe I don't really belong in that space. Um, so yeah, I feel like that was very scattered, but
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's so. There's a few things there. I think is so. I'll pick on the United States a little bit here. Um, I think United States is typically perceived as being part of the West, right? Western tradition, Enlightenment values, and definitely a Judeo-Christian background, right?
yeah,
So I think that I would assume that if you're living in an Eastern country, kind of broad way of defining that,
yeah,
that you would probably learn more about Eastern types of thought and Eastern types of philosophy and
right,
religions. So there's probably that kind of layer on it. But then also, I think um, this is an interesting part about this is that much of uh, reason and philosophical thought in the West does have this undercurrent of Protestant or Judeo-Christian influence
right,
at the least, and so much so that uh, some folks will argue that the Enlightenment or Western values or kind of a liberal democracy is at bedrock, Judeo-Christian, Protestant. I personally think I think there's an influence there. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say, yeah, you can't get your reason and your scientific inquiry without getting a little bit of, Jesus smuggled in there. There's, it's influence for sure, but I think you can divorce the two, especially now as we've gotten further and further away from some of that. I think probably for good. So, but yeah, I think maybe that's part of some of that, because I'll just say people in the West are really ignorant about anything outside of the West, right? If it's not in Western Europe and the United States and maybe a little bit of Latin America, people don't really know that. And that's part of education. That's part of, unless people are kind of looking for there's some specialized schools or something like that. But, people in the United States don't learn as much about dynasties from China, or the caste system in India and how that started, and how that works, and how that functions in modern day politics, or stuff in Indonesia, and there's in all of the various oceanic countries, and and then even Eastern Europe, right? There's certain things we know less of about Slavic countries, and so I think there's a big void and a gap, and so it doesn't surprise me that when you're studying all of these things, you're studying all these, philosophies, that it's like, hey, why is it always through this kind of one lens? What about a more global, broad scope?
Yeah.
I could see that there's definitely a deficit there, I would say.
Yeah. I think, on that point, it was kind of like, at a certain point, I started to feel that I couldn't really see myself in this Christian philosophy that I was doing, or that I felt that it wasn't really reflecting me. And that I was really interested in studying this kind of religion that's not my own, but there's also not really a place for me there. And I guess another reason that I kind of thought that was another kind of issue maybe that I encountered was not so much that people weren't willing to talk about Hinduism. It's like people were fine to talk about it in an academic kind of context. But I think one of the things that I value most about Hinduism is that it has this kind of openness in terms of being accepting towards people of other faiths. So if someone asked me to go to like a temple or a church or synagogue or whatever it is, I would be happy to do that. I would be happy to even pray to Christ or to do these other kind of things. But I don't think there's that same kind of maybe attitude in monotheistic religion, which makes sense. I mean,
it's, you guys are all going to hell. I mean, because you don't believe the right way. You don't believe in, God the Father through Jesus and, the whole thing. Right. And so everyone else is a sinner and they're lost and they're condemned to hell. Sorry. That's, you just don't get the ticket to ride. And that's just, it is a little bit like that.
Sorry?
It is a little bit like that with, Protestant denominations and faith, and then also Catholic. So when you look at all of Christendom, it is very much that. I mean, that's part of the dogma, right? That's part of the doctrine. Like that's
right. Yeah.
So there's they'll talk about other faiths, but they won't immerse or integrate or learn or be open as much. I mean, I'm sure some people do. I'm generalizing a little bit, but that there's less of that. You're less likely to be exposed to that. Whereas other pantheistic faiths will be less totalitarian about it, right? They'll be like, okay, yeah, this is cool. Like whatever, like, you can, with some, with Buddhism, with Hinduism, there's different types of Eastern faiths that are more, even with Islam, even though it's one of the big three, Jesus is mentioned more times in the Quran than, Prophet Muhammad, and they have a less antagonistic view of it. They don't believe he's God, but they have a less antagonistic view about Jesus than maybe the other way around. So even there, and that's part of one of the big three. So what's your dissertation on? What are you going to spend the next 2-3 years of your life doing?
All right. So I don't have an exact idea in terms of like an actual research.
Just give me general. Just give me the general, universe of where you're trying to look at.
Yeah, so I just like about to get my reading list approved for my comps exams, and so on that I have kind of three sections. But the main focus is basically continental approaches to the Holocaust. Is going to be the kind of main section, and then I have a historical section that's the 19th century German philosophy, which I have no background in.
Mhm.
But I kind of wanted to get a background in Kant on radical evil and other things to better understand German philosophy, where it's coming from, and
Mhm.
Arendt, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
talks about radical evil, but
So, okay. So, yeah, that sounds uh, quite the task, but I think it's very, very, that's, man, this is the Germans, I have a very big fondness for German philosophy. I really do. I like the way they think a lot.
yeah,
Their writing is absolutely just dense. And granted, I'm sure if I knew German, maybe it would be different, but oh my goodness, it's tough to weed through. I'm used to it now, but even still, like it's tough. It's not like um I mean the Greeks just wrote really nice. I like the way the Greeks write. Um but and the French have a style which is, I'm not crazy about how the French write. They have it's more understandable in some ways, but it's a certain type of attitude when I read French philosophy. But the Germans are just like they would just hitting you over and over with all of these arguments, and it's so good, but it's like God, it's like slogging through concrete half the time. But it's very good though. It's if you get through it, it's good. But
yeah.
so you are a brave soul to do that. So okay, so tell us then. I guess we can. This will be a jumping off point, and then we can get into the two big people. So I guess why is that your interest in terms of you said the Holocaust, right, is one of the big
Yeah,
pieces. It sounds like it will be here,
right.
and then German philosophy and sort of understanding how the connections are. At least that's definitely a variable in the mix there. Why is that interesting to you, or you're considering that?
So when I first started philosophy, I was actually an analytic. So I was really into this. I mean, I mentioned this, but I was really into Plantinga, Van den Bogen, and all these people. And I guess they were coming at it from this analytic perspective of the problem of evil. But I became really interested in this kind of like specific instance,
Mhm.
which I'm sure many people are in terms
Sure, yeah.
of this is like the kind of paradigm um, instance in human history of like complete evil.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of why it was a point of interest for me. I kind of made the switch pretty much completely nowadays from doing the kind of analytic philosophy to continental style stuff. Um,
So maybe this will be helpful. I'm sure you can explain this very well.
yeah,
Um, Explain for the listeners the there's essentially three schools within philosophy. Is a good way to say it. Is continental, analytic, and I think pragmatic is probably more current. Is another school of thought. But the two big schools of thought are continental and analytic. Maybe explain what they are and differences and people that are kind of associated with them.
yeah. I mean, this is a matter of debate within philosophy, as everything is. But
Right, right.
but I mean, continental. I'm pretty sure that the name comes from the continent of Europe,
Mhm.
and so it's pretty much. Again, there's debate about this, but I guess people say that either the jumping off point is Kant or Heidegger, um, and continental is generally done in a more poetic style, or maybe something more similar to literature sometimes, or and generally, I think continental is what people think of when they don't have any background in philosophy, and like they're not thinking about just Aristotle, Plato, and if they're looking beyond that, they're thinking of like Sartre or like um, Camus or like these other kinds of faces of philosophy. That I guess that's kind of the representation of the continental tradition.
Mhm.
And I think the continental tradition has been more historically kind of open to accepting kind of other disciplines in terms of like bringing in critical theory or like gender studies or these other things have
Mhm.
kind of all been folded into continental philosophy now. I mean, there's people who work on those things in analytic too, but I
Yeah,
think
I think that's right. Continental usually is more. Um, there's a little bit more of a. It has a sort of interdisciplinary feel
yeah,
of like, yeah, critical theory, sociology, psychology. There's different types of things that will start to play into the mix of kind of the ideas that are espoused within the school.
Yeah. And then, I mean, analytic, I believe it started with maybe it was the Vienna Circle or like,
Sounds right.
probably, yeah. I think, I mean, it started with kind of like this focus on logic, and
Mm-hmm.
interest in language, the limits of language, and these other kinds of how we can use math and science to guide philosophy as well. So analytic style philosophy has become kind of like the dominant tradition in most departments in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's most of the time the method is a heavy focus on like precise argumentation where you have these like step by step argument for things in a very like methodical kind of scientific way of looking at things. Um,
Yeah, and give us some examples of some main heavy hitters with analytic.
let's see. Probably, I guess I mean, like I said, probably the Vienna Circle, like maybe like Wittgenstein was an early analytic. Maybe Russell,
Mm-hmm.
Frege, people who work on all kind of logic stuff.
The postmodernists fit in here.
I think the postmodernists are continental, maybe, right?
Yeah, I think it depends, and sometimes you can have certain people that will do early kinds of their philosophy, and then their later philosophy kind of splits. And so I know Wittgenstein is one of the big guys here because of his whole
Right.
very precise. I don't know where Merleau-Ponty fits. The phenomenologists are always weird, but is he continental?
Yeah.
Yeah. But he has a very technical aspect because he's doing all of the like physiology kinds of stuff. So there's
Yeah.
traces of it. But again, as listeners will hear, people fight about this stuff and then they'll debate who goes where and, who's doing what.
Yeah. There's this tendency to think that analytic is like always associated with like math and science and stuff, but there's people within continental like Husserl who are like the idea of like a continental philosopher, but he works on logic, and these kinds of things that are traditionally associated with analytic. So
Yeah.
I mean, there are people working like analytic feminist philosophy or something as well.
And do you, I mean, just for you personally, it sounds like you are more fond of continental.
Yes.
I'm not saying you got to stake your flag here in the ground. I'm just saying,
Yeah,
but
I think, yeah, I've grown more of an appreciation. I didn't like it at all at first. The first time I read Heidegger in that class, I really didn't like him at all.
right. Yeah. That's usually most people's first impression. It's like, what the hell is this? I don't understand. Why are you having all these hyphenated words together? But
the worldhood of the world, and
yeah, it gets intense.
Or these other like long German terms, which is like, what is he doing?
Yeah, I think with all phenomenologists is that and he's sort of linked with that, I guess, but they're all trying to explain experience, and when you're trying to explain experiences, there's just not enough words that exist in any language to really explain certain experiences. And then when you get translation, it just all goes to shit. So it's just, it's really difficult. But yeah, Husserl, I like Husserl. Husserl is kind of the grandfather of phenomenology, trying to look at the science of essence as opposed to a science of realities or facts, and such as psychology or physiology. And then after Husserl, literally in terms of department chair at was it University of Freiburg?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Once he finished there, I don't know if he retired or whatever, and then Heidegger took the chair. And then he was there, and then I forgot who came after them, but yeah, and then so a lot of the phenomenologists are interested in these things. So the big guys are Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty is huge. Jean-Paul Sartre fits in there. He's existential / phenomenology.
Yeah.
I would, you can't really put Hannah Arendt there because she's
right.
She's a badass. So she doesn't fit in a box. You will not put me in a box. I'm not. She, to me, one of the reasons I absolutely adore her is she's more simple to write or to understand and to read, rather, her writing. And she's, even within philosophy, as much as they try and go for reason and logic or experience or whatever their angle is. She to me represents the true independent thinker. She's, and it's not disjointed, or she's not it's not that she doesn't have a compass. She is a independent thinker and truly takes things on the issues themselves as best as she can. And I think that's what just makes her kind of a giant, and why I like her thought. But so I guess, so we talked about continental analytic, but tell me then, as you're looking at this stuff and you work on your dissertation and looking at, German philosophy and everything, tell me your, I guess, love affair with, did it start with Hannah Arendt, or did it start with Heidegger, or how did you get connected with these two people?
It's kind of weird. So like I said, I took this class on Heidegger, and for a while I really wasn't into that style of philosophy. And even when I was applying to grad school, I was applying to analytic schools, and that was really my thing. But then I started grad school and I got really into Heidegger again. Maybe because I'm in this kind of like pluralist department, and everyone is talking about Heidegger all the time. So like adapt, die, maybe.
Yeah.
But but I got into Arendt actually more from her personal history. So I like learned about this affair between her and Heidegger, and that was kind of my jumping off point for like, okay, well now I'm interested in this. I mean, I guess a lot of people are interested in this. Like, why would this Jewish woman be interested in this Nazi professor? Like, what was the story there? So that's kind of what led me to look into that more. And then I got the first book of hers that I read was Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's a good book. So you started with Heidegger and you found your way to Hannah. So tell me, I guess, let's start, I guess, we'll start with that way, and then I guess we can kind of work backwards then. You take this class on being in time. So for listeners, Heidegger wrote Being in Time, which is his magnum opus, which is pretty amazing considering like that was really his like first major publication. Which it's unfinished in some ways, meaning it's completed, but there were supposed to be longer sections, which
this is like a third part or something, right?
Yeah, which he sort of kind of got to in contributions to the event. I think that's the work that's later Heidegger. And he had there's three major works of Heidegger. The first part is History on the Concept of Time. That's kind of his early goings where he's trying out his ideas, and then Being in Time is like the big book by him, and it's tremendous. We can talk about why, but so when you're hearing people talk about Heidegger, you take this class, and then you're saying that you kind of revisit Heidegger. Tell me if you can remember, where was the moment, or where was the like, or series of moments where Heidegger stopped being confusing. And I mean, he's always confusing forever, but where you could get it enough where like it just turned over and it just like clicked, and you're like, I get it all now. Like I get at least the bare essentials, the basics to understand his philosophy of thought, and then why it's tremendous. Like why people like go on and on and on about this. When did that kind of happen for you?
I think it happened for me in, so I was taking, in my spring semester of my first year of the program, I took a class on phenomenology, like more broadly, and we spent a good amount of time on Heidegger. We didn't read the whole book again, but we spent a good amount of time on Heidegger. And I think that time going back to it and trying to think through like, well, what am I going to write for the seminar paper? And I went back to Being in Time. And I think that's when it really hit me that there's a lot of these ideas in Heidegger that I really liked. I think the two kind of big ideas that really stuck with me was this focus on death, was one. And then the other one was he doesn't spend too much time on this, but he's really interested in this idea of idle talk. He talks a lot about kind of like how we've kind of lost the essence of our being, especially when we are with other people and we kind of fade into Das Man, or the one. That really interested me.
Interesting. It's interesting the interest of him in his thought. Those are the less, well, at least probably in more general circles, the less talked about concepts. I also think one of the concepts that's in Beginning of Time that's less talked about with Heidegger is his concept of care.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting concept. I still haven't flushed it out completely, but it's a very interesting concept that he introduces and talks about, especially in the second part of the book. Okay, so then you started saying, okay, so these two concepts, right? The idea of death, which I don't know if he had read it or how much it influenced, but there's a lot of Kierkegaard in this concept of Heidegger's death, I think. Whether it's directly or explicitly or more implicitly, Kierkegaard really, was the first kind of guy to really talk about death and then the anxiety outside of it in that kind of way. And Kierkegaard really is doing early phenomenology, even in the mid to late 19th century. And I hear a lot of the same themes. Of course, Heidegger does it in like his language and his way, right. But there's a lot of, I don't know if that he was building off of that or he just, just by happenstance, but so I guess tell us about those two themes of sorts, and then maybe we can hit the bigger themes with Heidegger. But those two concepts in particular, what did you like about them, and what about it is so, particularly arresting or powerful for you?
Yeah, so I think my interest in both of those is kind of linked. So Heidegger kind of begins by, I think it's pretty early on in the text when he talks about this concept of idle talk. Mm-hmm. And he says, like I said, that when we're kind of talking to other people, we kind of lose our own kind of individuality or our sense of being. And we are kind of lost in the one. And we talk as if we were the one. And we've kind of just lost the ability at that point, or maybe not the ability, but we've kind of lost sight of how to make meaning for ourselves. And so then I guess I said this in one of my papers, but I feel like Heidegger then kind of makes this brinksmanship kind of a move where he's kind of driving us to the edge. And he wants us to kind of like renounce this idea of the one and radically kind of redefine meaning for ourselves by kind of getting away from the one or these other people. And to do that, you need to be in this kind of like ground moods of like, you need to experience anxiety or boredom. And you need to have that kind of encounter with it in a real radical sense in order to kind of reconstitute meaning for yourself. But to me, that kind of took on a kind of like dangerous read. I don't know, like the idea that in order for you to like find this new meaning or to really confront being, you need to kind of go to the edge and you need to kind of like, I don't know if that makes sense, but
very painfully in terms of the reading of it. A lot of Heidegger's work, especially in Being in Time, or his arguments rather, will do this. It will just kind of he'll start with a concept and he'll just absolutely beat it to death until it takes you all the way to the end of it, or he'll try, or you get very much into the fundamentals of like, at bottom, what are we talking about? Or at bottom, what are we trying to explain? I agree. The idea of the idle talk is that we can explain maybe Dasein in a minute, but my understanding of it is similar. Is the fact that we have that most people are hiding out in the anonymity of the other, the they. Right, this average everydayness, right? These words that he's using is that, in some ways, we by encountering the other, right, the other being, that we're having to, in some ways, make we have to make agreements with ourselves where we're less about ourselves and we have to include another being in our space or in our world. And when we're doing that, if we're doing it in an inauthentic way, what happens is that we're allowing the they or the other to take control or prescribe potential meaning and or value by the engagement. Right now, there's plenty of counter arguments to this about like, okay, well, sure, but you got to interact with people in the world, and like, what the hell? Like, you can't just be by yourself. And he's not saying that you should be hermits or you should be alone. And I think what he's trying to say is that to do it with authenticity, he's really big on those two terms, authentic and inauthentic, to be able to have the most, I guess you could say productive, as sort of a value judgment I'm placing, but some type of efficiency or productiveness on how you interact, where the other person and what they're doing or not doing is then a determinant of how you then do or don't do things. Of course, you need to engage with people, but you need to do it with purpose and with kind of a directionality, right? And directionality is how he thinks about space, which is super interesting. And so by that regard, when you take it all the way to the end, then that's where he starts talking about, if you don't do this, and if you don't do this, and if you don't do this, you start to have these themes that are dark, right? This is where the death idea comes in, right? That, and this is very much like Kierkegaard, which, I'm not a huge fan of Kierkegaard, but this is like his claim to fame, which is once you understand that you die, right? And everyone knows that you're going to die.
Yeah.
There's this angst or anguish that you have. And so you start working backwards and you're like, oh, okay, well, I have to live, right? I don't know when I'm going to die, but it's going to happen. Oh man, that's terrible. There's this existential anxiety. And so then you say, well, how do I want to live my life? And you realize that you have so many, there's so much potential of these different possibilities.
Right.
And there's a compounding anxiety that happens of, well, which one do I do? How do I live? What's the right way? What's the way if I'm going to die, how do I do that? And so for Heidegger, at least my understanding, you correct me, understanding that you die or understanding that that's going to happen.
Right.
Why would you live inauthentically with this average everydayness, with this idle talk that other people are kind of putting the compass for, and they're saying, we're going to do it this way, or we're going to do it this way. And his mind is your time is limited and use it well, essentially. And don't preoccupy yourself with things that have less potential for value or meaning. That's sort of kind of my reading. I don't know how you see it, but
yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. That when you're kind of with these other people, you lose sight of the fact that you're going to die. You kind of lose sight of the important kind of things, but especially this kind of confrontation with death. And so it's only when you kind of get away from that and don't allow the one to make decisions for you is when you can radically kind of remake your life and be able to project the possibilities for yourself in time.
Yeah. So he mentions the idle talk kind of early on, almost as like a tease, and then he gets really into it, I think probably middle to second half of the book. But before, there's two main concepts maybe we can talk about with Heidegger, that before you can get to this good stuff, right? And again, you and I have read this enough where, we can kind of explain it, but it really does feel that way. It feels, it's trying to translate through the writing. And I don't think I know we're picking on his writing, but it's not that it's bad writing. It's just painful to get through. And I don't think he's trying to do that intentionally. I think he's just trying to get each part worked out and trying to explain, not making assumptions on anything and explaining things. And so that's the point of doing all that, but it's just painful to get through.
I don't think that he's just throwing in the German terms for like the hell of it or anything.
Right. Yeah.
It's there to like, he's trying to revolutionize this language that already, these terms already exist. He's trying to give them a new kind of sense or meaning, or reclaim their meaning if he's going to agree sometimes. Yeah.
So the two big themes for Heidegger's philosophy, we can explain them and then maybe explain why they're so momentous. So the big one is Dasein, which is a German word. The literal translation is das, and then da and sein is being there. And it's the explanation of how humans exist. He has something else which he calls existentials, which are things that exist that do not have Dasein. Dasein is it's not only just human, right? Dasein is one's being, but it is kind of being in itself. He's trying to get at the bottom of it, that there is all of the parts of you, the totality of you, is something that we call existing. But we exist differently than, this cup on my table exists, right? And not only is it, the reason for spending so much time on this is because there's a few reasons, but he wants to make the distinction between things that exist, trees, plants. He talks a lot about objects, hammers, things like that.
Yeah.
Right. They exist in a different way. They exist because they are, but we are, and then we are more than that, right? We have, you have the existence of being, and then outside of that, you have essence. Other things have essence, but you would only understand their essence if your Dasein, your being, bumps into them. Not that you bring them into existence, but that you're using some of their potential for is being uncovered right at that moment, right? And so you're kind of an unlocking of sorts. That's your being is unlocking. And so with Dasein, he not only is it for humans, but it is for each individual human, right? So Dasein is always possessive. So I only have my being, right? You only have your being. I don't have that. We each have it, right? The aspect of being, but we don't have similar ones. Each one has their own specific way of being. The reason why that's so important, so it's an ontological argument, right? How do you understand something that is being or existing? But he wraps that up with space and world, meaning how our being interacts with the space around us. And he has different delineations for that, right? So the ontical, the ontological, the worldhood, and there's one other one. There's 4 different types of the environment. At that point, it becomes where all of the metaphysics of things and space and epistemology, so how we know things, how we operate, how the world happens to exist, is wrapped up within our Dasein. It's wrapped up within our being. And that's the revolutionary aspect of Heidegger's philosophy, is your Dasein, your being, how you exist in the world. We can only it may exist, but it's not going to exist in certain ways until you uncover it with your being interacting with it. And so therefore, his ontology is wrapping up metaphysics and physics in that way within being itself. And that's the power of Heidegger's philosophy, and then how he just spends 700 pages or whatever explaining all that. So that's how I understand being. I don't know if you understand that way. How do you understand?
I also think that the other really big, powerful part of Heidegger's philosophy is that he is basically trying to overturn what's already been done in the history of philosophy.
Yes.
He wants to say that none of these people have understood being correctly so far. Being has been kind of associated with presence. And that, he talks about these different kind of modes of being in terms of like ready to hand and present at hand all of that. But there's this idea that being is more than just presence. And on top of that, there's also this idea that humans, or like human Dasein, is special in the sense that we are able to pose the question of being. And what kind of sets us apart is our ability to ask this question of what it means to be, which trees or rocks or animals maybe don't even have. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think in that way, it's a kind of a meta thing, right? It's like the fact that we have, if you map it onto, I guess, an evolutionary model, right? The fact that we have frontal lobes and a prefrontal cortex, which allows us to do abstract reasoning. And we know this. We know that we're the at least mammal, maybe living organism that can abstract at like crazy levels that, our next closest relative, chimps and then bonobos, they can't abstract, but they can't do it at the levels that we can do it. And so it's less likely that our primate cousins are thinking about, why do I exist? And what does that mean? And how do I, it's less likely that they're doing that. They're probably thinking about similar things of life, but maybe they do, but to our best of our knowledge, it's likely they don't, or any organism. And that doesn't mean that we're better. So that's not a value judgment. It just means that it is different, and it's important to make that distinction. And yes, you're absolutely right about how he's trying to say, hey, yeah, Descartes, incomplete. There's a lot of assumptions there. He didn't get it all right. The cogito's great. I think, therefore I am. But like, yeah, he spends time, Merleau-Ponty as well, spends time saying like, yeah, really important at the time, didn't flush it out all the way.
Right.
And there's, they talk about Kant. There's a lot of talk about Hegel. You can't do German philosophy unless you talk about Hegel, the master of creating a system. So Heidegger is really saying like, yeah, everyone did it incomplete, or they talked about it in different ways.
Right.
And the closest person to do that was Nietzsche. But again, Nietzsche's philosophy is a philosophy of life. So Nietzsche was less concerned about being and the person. He was more concerned about literally life itself. Heidegger has his interpretive, Heidegger taught most, I've read this somewhere. He taught most on Aristotle in his lectures, which is fascinating. And he taught, I think the next Nietzsche is the thing he talked about most, or taught most on and lectured on the most. And so he likes Nietzsche a lot, but he then takes kind of his, Dasein being ontology and then kind of overlays it on top of Nietzsche thinking. Sometimes I think incorrectly, but it's an interesting lens in which he does it. Do you want to do worldhood or no? It's so complicated. Being is hard in itself, but it's just Heidegger's world. It's so fascinating. It's really fascinating, but it's very complicated because of all the different modes.
Yeah, I don't know what would be a good kind of way to even start with that. I guess it's important to note that Heidegger does think that we are in a world. We're situated in a world, and he has this other kind of concept that I'm really into, that he talks about thrownness or Geworfenheit.
Yeah. It's a really cool idea. Maybe explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's this idea that we're thrown into the world, and we don't really have a choice in the matter, especially in terms of our circumstances or what kind of, just what our kind of situatedness is. And so that's kind of part of our facticity, which is another kind of term that he brings in. And it has to do kind of with, again, these are the kind of circumstances that you're born into in the world. But when you're thinking about taking these authentic steps to kind of change things, you're trying to shed that in a sense, or you're trying to move away from it in a way that you're trying to make meaning for yourself outside of just that. But I don't know if you think.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's a great way to explain it, because the thrownness is a really cool concept, because it's basically taking determinism in terms of like, that we have our genes and our appearance and our gender and the very deterministic heritable traits that we have. And he's just basically mapping it onto a philosophical concept of like, he's not doing that. I mean, I'm kind of doing that, but that's a way to understand it, is like, we don't choose where we're born. We don't choose that we live or that we exist in the world. And he doesn't really think that we have much choice of anything, actually, in some ways. But then you're basically working, I think he calls them modes in the environment, but you could basically say dimensions, right? That may be true, but it doesn't mean that we're resigned to it, where we just kind of throw our hands up and we give up and we're like, oh, that's it. I'm just here for the ride. that's one dimension of thrownness or being in the world, but that there's other ways of being in the world, and then how we look at that, right? In terms of like the ontic way is like the more like descriptors, but then it's like where you have certain ideas where you say, in the academic world, like we say those types of ways that we have a certain meaning when we say that, which is different than like the planet that we live on, right? The world. And so he gives different examples of what do we mean by different types of inhabiting and understanding the space we live in,
right,
based in terms of how we function or maneuver, and then also how we are electing to be, in that space, and then with different contexts. And so he doesn't talk that much, at least in Being in Time, on spatiality. I think the person that writes the most about spatiality is Merleau-Ponty. But Heidegger looks at spatiality in terms of two ways. It's a de-severance and directionality.
right.
And with de-severance, it's basically that whether you like it or not, you're trying to always bring things close to you or further from you.
Right.
Well, what is the key thing in each of those scenarios? Your being, your Dasein, what you're doing. And so it just, everything comes back to that fundamental principle of that's how you operate in space. Space is, it doesn't really exist if you really think about it, much like time doesn't, right? It's how we inhabit the space. And so he looks at it in terms of a closeness or proximity, right? When I walk to the table, my being is becoming closer to it. If I walk away from it, it's becoming farther from it, which is right. I think that Merleau-Ponty does a better job of explaining it, where he says, yeah, you have the object, you have the background, foreground, or whatever, and then you have you, right? And so you have these, you basically think of them in terms of dimensions, right? Where you don't understand an object without a background, right? It doesn't sit in isolation. And you only understand it from you and your perspective, where you're saying, hey, I'm looking at this object with a background from my perception, right? That's this whole thing, phenomenology, perception. And so in that way, he sees space as, we're of space. We inhabit the space. We don't, we're not a part of it per se. We inhabit it. And then by inhabiting it, him and Heidegger agree, you uncover the potentiality of things. So I'll give an example of this, because I think the space piece is one aspect that you can understand in terms of different environments or the world in general, whichever way, if whatever world, type of world you're thinking of. So for example, if you come to my house, you will know that someone lives here, but you will know that if you know something about me, you'll know that I'm in here because of how I choose, right? I choose to arrange my living space. Right. I put the TV here, I put the couch here, I hang these pictures in this order, in this fashion. That requires, if you want to use the word author, no one would use it that way, but that requires a mover, that requires someone's being to interact with that. The space outside of that is, but it becomes these ways of uncovering the potential aspects of space with your being a part of it. And when you start seeing all these things in the way that he explains it and some of the other guys explain it, then you start seeing how much potential value is possible that's left to be uncovered, right? Because in his view, you don't know everything about your being, which is a pretty terrifying thought, right? And so there are so many things, and it's this continuous uncovering and unveiling that we're doing. And if we allow others to do that for us, we are
out.
basically handing over our ability or our power to do that. And that's living inauthentically in his view. Living authentically is to make decisions for oneself within their preset world or environment to say, how do I find value and meaning in things?
Right.
And that's the power of his argument, because sure, you can make that argument without spending, 300 pages talking about being. But when he does that, you just can't, you just can't go anywhere outside of that. I mean, he's just got it all the way down to bottom first principles,
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I see it.
That's where, you mentioned earlier care. I think that's where that comes in, where you have this kind of investment into the world, or in kind of, like I said, like reconstituting meanings. And I mean, he also talks later about this very like wonky kind of idea of the call of conscience too, where
Like you get
this call from within, but it's like not coming from like some source, but it's actually you. And so it's like this interesting idea of like, I don't know, actually, now that I think of it, it's maybe kind of similar to the idea of the conversation with the I, the conversation with the self in Arendt as well. Kind of different way, but
I think of it, there's definitely a dialogue feature to it. I always thought of the call to conscience as like it's like the Freudian death instinct or Nietzsche's will to power of sorts. It's this like almost like this force, right? I know that sounds really like Star Wars and everything, but it feels like this kind of force behind things in all living organisms that, it's just there, it kind of lives there, and it's driving everything.
Right.
And we have this call to conscience where it's like, I probably should do this, but if I don't, there's this kind of guilt that happens.
Yeah.
And it's the call to conscience is, how do you live authentically? Where the way you live authentically is knowing one's Dasein, knowing one's being, which is, how do I have authorship? And if the easy way to not do that is to just say, well, I have to go to work. I have to listen to my boss. I have to do what someone says. I have to turn my papers in. I have to do that. And that is true, but it's true again on one level. It's one dimension. It is not in all the specific ways not mapped out. And you have the ability to find how you want to do that, to create the meaning and value, to live authentically, and to sometimes maybe not do some of those things, right? This feeling of I have to do it this way because that's how it is, or, that would be letting they make the decisions for you. And so that call to conscience, I always read that as, you should live authentically. And then if I don't, I have all this guilt because I'm living inauthentically. And it's a kind of abandonment of your own being itself, which is crazy, because it's still that existence resides within you. And so you're carrying that around. And so, then, so that along with the care piece, along with the thrownness, all these strange words he uses, this is where there was a whole line of thought in the 50s and 60s from kind of some psychoanalysts that kind of looked to Heidegger and said, whoa, this is some really cool stuff. And a lot of that is developed from what's developed out of that is the existential humanistic therapies that some people use. So there's some practical application to it. Okay. Anything else you want to say about, I could talk Heidegger all night. Anything else you want to say about Heidegger?
Anything else about Heidegger? I guess my concerns with Heidegger, after having read Being and Time, I think the two kind of lasting ones is, the first kind of idea goes back to what I was saying earlier about, I feel like Heidegger kind of endorses this kind of brinksmanship. So we're supposed to have this radical kind of encounter with anxiety or with boredom. And it seems like, we're supposed to reconstitute meaning in an authentic way after that. But I also wonder, if we're really having this kind of authentic experience with anxiety, wouldn't that just shake everything for you in a way that I don't even know, would you be able to recover from that? It kind of makes me think of like that Nietzschean concept of like, you look into the abyss looks into you. Or I don't know
Yeah.
if that's the exact
No,
quote.
that's right. That's from it's Twilight of the Idols, I believe it's where it's from. I
Yeah,
could be
so
wrong on that,
I don't
but
know. I guess that I just wonder, like, is it possible really to have that kind of encounter with anxiety and then to just go back into the world and function like any other person? Or is it just the case that we will never really have that kind of real, authentic experience with anxiety or boredom?
yeah, that's a good question. I think that his probably answer would be something like, you know, you don't know unless you try it, right? How
Right.
else are you going to know? Do you want other people figuring it out for you, or you want to figure it out yourself? And I do think there's a existential theorist that did more on the therapy side, but Eric Fromm, who said,
Mm,
um, people love having other people tell them what to do. They're terrified of freedom. They're
right.
terrified of making their own life because it's so unknown and there's so much ambiguity, and there's a comfort in allowing people to
Right.
make those decisions. And that's why people will follow individuals that do that, even if they don't completely agree. If they feel like they're not having to do that, they like the heuristic, right? They like the shortcut at large scale and at small scale. And there's this element of people like being told what to do because it's too terrifying. It's too unknown to
Right.
try and figure out yourself, your own being, which is wild because it's only yours, right? It's the possessive. Sure, there's anxiety there, but how, I don't want somebody else telling me how to do that. I don't even know it for myself. How could someone else know it, right? And there's this like, I think there's just a kind of resignation of like, whoa, too much. That's too much for me. And so, but I think your question is a good one though, because it's like, I might say that, or I might think that, and this does go to the psychology of things. It's like, but some people just, they're not there, or they don't want to do that. They're not there at that time, or or they have too many negative experiences, and that becomes, I
Yeah,
think, more interesting, it's more complicated, right? It's not a unilateral one size fits all thing.
and for a while I was really interested in reading on like kind of Heidegger and depression, or like
Mm-hmm.
the kind of like anxiety that's like, I mean, not Heideggerian anxiety, but like the
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Clinical
diagnosed
anxiety.
version.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
clinical anxiety. So I was thinking about like, when we're kind of prescribing that we need to have this kind of radical encounter with anxiety, or we need to kind of confront death. It seems like some people are going to be like that. I'm not sure that everyone can take that on, or if they do that, that might actually end up being kind of dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Heidegger is the type to like advocate for something like suicide.
No.
Of course, but
No. I mean, that's
yeah,
for
I don't think that's a very
Kafka and Camus, right?
kind of possibility for him.
Right. Yeah. No, he doesn't advocate for that. Neither does Nietzsche. A lot of those guys don't advocate. They're so wrapped up in so much, like there's so much potential for meaning. Like, killing yourself would be like completely antithetical to that. But I think your question's a good one. Yeah, I think it is a really good question to ask, and I have a suspicion that there's some thinkers I'm thinking about that have tried to do some of that. But yeah, I have to think about that. But it's a really good question. You said there was two problems. There one problem you had
Yeah.
with that was one problem. What else?
I mean, the other kind of problem. I mean, I don't have much background in Merleau-Ponty, but whenever I read Being in Time, I always think that there's kind of like I don't know how to explain this, but like kind of like a floaty element to it, in the sense that being feels like very ethereal like it's supposed to be very rooted in the world, but somehow I get this kind of like solipsistic
Mm-hmm.
feeling to the
Mm-hmm.
book. And it doesn't seem like being is embodied, and I know that Heidegger doesn't want to maybe tie things down in that way, but there is a sense in which being feels kind of disjointed.
Amorphous of sorts. Yeah. Yeah. Read Merleau-Ponty. You'll feel just fine. I mean, it's all body all the way down. And that's such a nice compliment of both of them, right? They have their differences, but
Yeah.
I mean, Merleau-Ponty is all about that. all about it. Like that is literally his bread and butter. It's just, how do you experience being through the body?
Right.
And he goes so far as to say you can't. It's impossible. That's the only way, and you need it. And that's why he has an emphasis on, and I think that's probably why he's more technical. Like he has some really dense stuff in there about like depth perception and vision and some really technical aspects of like the physiology of things.
Yeah.
And yeah, but it's the embodied kind of stuff of the phenomenology within the body. And that's why he spends a lot of time talking about perception.
Yeah.
And he spends a lot of time talking about attention and your body in space. And because it is all there again, it's the dimensions, but of how you perceive it, which perspective. But the key component to that is it's through the body.
Okay.
Not that it's the be all end all, but that it's a kind of it's like a vehicle of being to ride in and exist. And so yeah, it's all you really need for Merleau-Ponty is I mean, he's got invisible, whatever is good, but phenomenology of perception is like his, it's like the big thing. Like if you read that, you'll be like, okay, I get it. It's good. It's good. I just reread it. So it's really, really good. It's dense, but it's not as dense as Being in Time, but it's dense though. Okay. It's a little more modern. So it's, I think it was written in the 50s, late 40s or 50s. So it's a little bit more current with what was going on at the time. He had a nice pulse of like psychology and understanding, and Gestalt theory, and it's a little bit more of the times, which is kind of a nice thing. So, okay, so let's leave Heidegger for now, and let's talk about Hannah Arendt. You probably know more about her than I do. I've read her stuff, but I didn't get introduced to Hannah till much later in my life. I knew Heidegger for a while. So I've sat with him for a long time. So I've read Hannah Arendt stuff a few times, but you probably know more about her. Okay, so we've hit Heidegger pretty hard. We've covered a lot of stuff with him. So hopefully, I always like talking about him. Hopefully, listeners weren't bored to tears talking about being and all these weird words. So yeah, I really want to hear your thoughts, and you can educate me more on Hannah Arendt, because I again, like I said, I've read her stuff, but yeah, tell us, I guess, a little bit like what you're reading and what your understanding is of her, like kind of central themes to her work and her philosophy, and she, like we've mentioned earlier in the talk here, that she's kind of a hard lady to pin down. You can't put her in a box, so that's kind of her kind of mode. But just kind of give us as much as you understand, like her central theses and her main thought within her work.
Yeah, so Hannah Arendt is a really interesting figure, and I think she's one of those people who, knowing a bit about her background is like really helpful to understanding her philosophy. She was born she was born German Jewish, from a secular family, I believe. I think maybe the same hometown as Kant. I could be wrong about that, but I believe, it was somewhere in Germany. But he ended up studying under some of the biggest names in philosophy at the time. She was a student of Martin Heidegger's, ended up having an affair with him, but then her dissertation advisor was actually Karl Jaspers, who was more into working on psychology. And at least as I understand it, he was more into that kind of stuff. And then wrote her dissertation on Augustine and love in St. Augustine. And then eventually married Gunther Stern, who was actually a relative of Walter Benjamin, interestingly. So she's just connected to all of these different people. But I mean, she was able to escape this kind of internment camp that she was in after a while. She was doing political work that she was caught by the police for. But eventually she escaped and got to the U.S., where she taught at a bunch of different schools. She taught at the New School, U Chicago, I think some places on the West Coast as well at some point. But yeah, so she's she's really well known, I guess, for a few different works. Origins of Totalitarianism is one. That's a huge monster level work. I think it's like 900 pages or something.
Yeah, it's at least 750. It's
At least, yeah,
750
it's pretty long. And then you have The Human Condition, which I think is her most like philosophical work. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I would say that that's probably her most philosophical work. But she also has this interview with Gunter Gauss where she talks about why she thinks philosophy and politics shouldn't really, or I guess why she doesn't want to be called a philosopher, because she thinks she'd rather prefer to be called as a political theorist, because she thinks philosophy and politics have been kind of in conflict to a certain degree. And that, but that has to do again with her kind of distinctions between thinking and acting, which is a really huge kind of theme for her throughout her works, but especially in stuff like, especially in, I guess, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Human Condition, Responsibility and Judgment.
The Life of the Mind, I think, is where I read a lot of that stuff.
Right, The Life of the Mind.
Which I think was one of her last works. Am I right on that?
Yes, The Life of the Mind was her last work, and it was supposed to be split into 3 sections. So it was thinking, willing, and judging. But she died actually. She had the paper and the typewriter, and was just typing the last section, and she actually died. And then they found like she had just put in the epigraph. But actually, I think Ronald Beiner has put together her lectures on Kant and his political philosophy, and people say that's kind of like what she would have said in the judgment section of The Life of the Mind if she had lived to write it. So yeah, that's just a collection of what she has to say about the Kant's critique of judgment. And
yeah, that's also some dense reading. that's some tough reading. Yeah, so I guess the biggest things would be thinking and doing are probably her biggest, or thinking in action or whatever, is like philosophically, I guess. And then a lot of her stuff is her political commentary on things, which is really what Eichmann in Jerusalem and Origins of Totalitarianism really is. And there's just big monster work. So maybe tell us a little bit about the thinking and doing component of her philosophy, and then we can do the more political stuff.
Yeah, so I think the important thing to remember for her is that in the Human Condition, she offers this like tripartite distinction that's really famous between labor, work, and action. And so labor and work are kind of these unfree domains of human life, and they're kind of associated with the private realm and the household and fulfilling biological needs. And again, she's kind of like Heidegger. She's looking back to the Greeks and taking on their kind of model of what their life was like in order to kind of construct this political picture for herself. And so we have the private realm, which is where we kind of fulfill the needs of labor and work. And then we have the public realm, which he calls the polis. And the public realm is where we act, we speak, we do things, and we want to do that in order to make our mark on human history, to interact with other people. And to basically exhibit this kind of care for the world, or what she likes to call amor mundi, I guess, in the Latin. But yeah, and I'm trying to think if there's anything I missed with that.
So but the 3 parts, right?
Yes. Yeah. So those are the 3 parts. And then I guess thinking and acting come in where she has another kind of distinction that she has is between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa. So the vita activa is the active life, the life of the people who are in the polis, who are gathering to do politics, who want to speak, who want to act, and make their mark. And then you have the vita contemplativa, which is about the life of the mind, about thinking. And for Arendt, thinking is basically, the way she defines it is this conversation of the I with itself, where she's taking this from Plato's Gorgias. Or she takes it from a line or two in Plato's Gorgias, the idea of this conversation of the I with itself, where I'm kind of a 2-in-1, where I'm split. And in any time that I'm kind of thinking, I'm not doing it with any particular aim in mind, but what I'm doing is kind of conversing with myself. And for Arendt, we want that this two in one, or this split within us, is kind of harmonious. And that's kind of where like people like Eichmann go wrong. They either lose the ability to kind of have this two in one at all. They can't think for themselves. Or the kind of person that they inhabit the two in one with is just not hospitable, or not, they're not harmonious. The two parts are not somehow working together. And so she says, like, you wouldn't even a murderer wouldn't want to live with himself, because he would have to face this like two in one where, you want to be in harmony with your own self.
That the two aspects are integrated into, excuse me, I guess you could say the holistic aspect of the person. And so, this is, it's not entirely self-talk. Yeah. That's a component of it, right? Like that happens, but there is these kind of two, I guess you could say modes. It's hard to explain it, but it's not just, do I talk to myself and do I say, okay, don't do this, don't do that, or something. I feel like some people kind of colloquially say like, like good angel, bad angel on your shoulder and stuff you've seen in like old cartoons or something. It's not quite that way, but it is this kind of two modes or modalities that need to be or should be harmoniously synced together. And so you have the contemplative life, or the life of the mind, and then the life of action, or the active life. And so how does this contemplative mind map onto the active life?
I guess that's a huge kind of point of debate in Arendt studies, kind of relationship between, so in the human condition, she places a lot of emphasis on the life, like the vita activa. And this idea that action is basically like action is like the human condition. The point is for us to be able to appear in public, and to say important things. But then later in Responsibility and Judgment, and between past and future and some of these other works, she goes on to kind of go back on that and say, actually, no, the most important role is the person who's doing judging, the person who's carrying out judgment, and especially from the role of a spectator. Because an actor kind of is spontaneous, and they're doing these things in the heat of the moment, and they don't have a full view of what's going to go on. But the person who's doing judging, the person who's conducting judgment, is kind of able to step back and look at things from a kind of, what she borrows from Kant to say, this kind of like broadened or enlarged mentality, where you can like put yourself into other people's perspectives, or kind of use your imagination to think through different possibilities before you come to some kind of like verdict, or actually act on whatever it is.
Yeah. And so how do you understand, this is always a tough part for me. And so tell me if you, what you think about this, or your ideas about this. Is I always had a challenging time with how she's using or understanding judgment. It's a tough one, right? And I think it's probably, like you had mentioned, last part of her work was unfinished with that. But there's enough things that we know, kind of what you were saying about her lectures about Kant's, pure judgment and all that. But how do you understand her ideas of judgment?
So I think she's very heavily drawing from Kant with the critique of judgment. So just as a kind of brief summary, even summarize Kant briefly, but
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
But in the critique of judgment, I mean, Kant is trying to come up with an analytic of the beautiful, and the way to do this is kind of to abstract from. You don't want these aesthetic judgments, or judgments of taste, as he calls it, to be focused too much on form, or the goodness or of something. You want it to kind of be focused more on, I guess you want it to be as like objective as possible, in a sense. And so Arendt really picks up on this idea that like you want judgment to be objective, and you don't just want it to be this subjective thing, but you also want it to be universally valid for everyone. So it's kind of like trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Yes, it is. Yes.
But,
Yeah. That's what makes it a little difficult, I think, is
yeah.
like, okay, so you want it to be both things. That seems difficult. I think you might be able to do it, but I don't know if we have enough of what the kind of, not the how to, but a little bit more expansive on what it looks like, I guess.
Yeah. So you want to be able to say that the rose is beautiful, but you don't want to be able to refer, like Kant thinks you don't refer to some concept to say that the rose is beautiful.
Mhm.
And it also just can't be this like sensual kind of thing where you see the rose and you're like, oh, it's like, I don't know, I love scarlet or something.
Right. Right. So like, there's this sort of dichotomy of like, yes, objectively, but that's very hard to do, right? Objectively. But I guess you could say, yeah, this breaks down culturally, I think, because
Some kind of like je ne sais quoi about beauty.
yeah,
Trying to
yeah.
with this critique of judgment. And I think she's trying to basically extend that into the political realm. She's talking about judgment in the political sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's right. Is, which is, I mean, obviously relevant. Yeah. The judgment thing is hard. I've always had a hard time with that. And I haven't read her on that as much as maybe some other things, but I think the way you explain it is right. And do you have any opinions one way or the other about her idea of it or how she reads Kant or?
I wrote a paper about this actually just now for my Kant class. And I ended up saying, I guess, that I think she misappropriates him. I mean, everyone kind of knows in like the Arendt scholarship that she's like done this very idiosyncratic, like very unique reading of Kant. And she herself acknowledges that in these lectures. She says, like my reading of Kant is very non-standard. But I think there's certain points where she like actually picks out things in Kant, like, or maybe not picks out things in Kant, kind of misreads him or like misinterprets him and kind of does it in a willful way. And it's not like to the spirit of his philosophy. So there's parts where she'll even like selectively omit things that he said to make it fit with her picture of what the public realm should be. And Kant in the Critique of Judgment, he basically talks about like common sense, like the sensus communis and all of that. And this idea of like how the public should function into our aesthetic judgments in sections 40 and 41. But then beyond that, it's kind of like, it's not as essential maybe to his philosophy, I think, as it is for her. She, I think, is really just using those few sections to build her own kind of project, which isn't a wrong thing to do, but I think she's reading into Kant what isn't there. And he has his own political philosophy. He has essays on perpetual peace, and he has his stuff on the philosophy of right in Metaphysics of Morals. So,
that it's interesting because it seems like she's basically emphasizing a certain part within how her framework is.
Yeah.
As opposed to, Kant has a whole system, right? He has a whole like thing of what he's doing. And, but it's interesting though, because she knew Kant pretty well. She lectured him and she knew him pretty well. So, maybe it's one of the mysteries, or people will continue to debate it, but it is a very interesting thing of like, how do you, because I haven't read Kant in, oh my God, so many years, but his whole thing was trying to get at kind of the objective aspects of things.
Yeah.
And it's not that he condemned the subjective life, but that he was more interested on, well, before you can get to the subjective, because there's too much variance, you need a set of principles of objective realities. And so he was mapping this onto judgments and beauty and things like that. Of course, wasn't it Heidegger that said the objective and the subjective kind of converge and submerge on each other or whatever? So it's very interesting. I see what you're saying. It does seem like she's trying to have her cake and eat it too. Okay, so kind of, I think that's good. So having her background with some of her, kind of philosophical underpinnings, how do you see then how this carries through or translates with her work on political theory? So maybe we can they're wrapped up with each other. Which one? She wrote Origins of Totalitarianism first.
I believe, yeah.
In the 50s, 53, 5, something like that.
Yeah.
And then Eichmann, we can get to in a minute. That was in 61, I want to say.
Maybe 63, maybe?
Maybe that, something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. So maybe just say in general, I mean, it's just kind of hard to pin down. What was her idea of political theory? And then maybe you can tell us a little bit about origins of totalitarianism.
Yeah, so actually with Arendt, I don't actually know much about her actual political stuff. I haven't read on revolution. I've read on violence. The very little I read though actually kind of put me off in a way. Like it seems, I think I respect her political theory more when it comes to kind of analyzing like totalitarianism or like the continent. But when it comes to American politics, I think she's very, very problematic. I don't think she has a proper understanding of the kind of structural problems that America has had with racism or with other kinds of issues here. And I guess there's also this criticism of Arendt that she tries to act like she's one of the boys. She doesn't want to kind of acknowledge the fact that she's a woman. And even in the Gunter Gauss interview towards the end of her life, she's kind of like being asked, what is it like to be a woman in philosophy? And she's like, I've never really thought of myself as like, I don't think that's important.
Right. But yeah, she definitely downplayed it. I know she did that, but yeah, that's her criticism is, I agree with you 100%. That's how I see it too. I don't really look to her for like American politics. Just, again, she just is from, it's all like she can have her opinions, but it's just not, it's not quite the same, but it's like, it would be like me going to Germany and trying to talk about like, German politics. I don't know I might have political theory or a framework, but it's just, very different. And so that's where people like, they start throwing around the whole, like, she's racist or whatever. And it's like, no, I just think she's ignorant. I just don't think she knows the structures here. I mean, she's a brilliant woman, but I think just some of the cultural things, she just is not, she came here later in her life and, just very different. And she's coming from, literally from Nazis and, she didn't do a concentration camp, but she did like, step down from that internment camps. And
just still pretty horrible.
Yeah. And she was a refugee and she, just all those things like, that's her understanding of things. And so she was just dealing with totally different scale and level of things than at a very, I don't say special time, but a very unique time in history. She just isn't, I don't think she really got kind of American structures and things like that. So I'm with you. I don't really read her for like American politics, like her American political commentary. It's like, whatever. She can have her opinion, but I think I would agree with you. Her big stuff is on totalitarian states. So you've read Origins of Totalitarianism?
Yeah, most of it.
Did you like it?
I liked the third part the most, I think.
I know it's divided into three parts. She talks about anti-Semitism.
About anti-Semitism. She talks about the Dreyfus affair. The second part is about colonialism.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then the third part is about, so the reason I guess I'm a bit hesitant on Origins is because, I haven't read the first section, but I have read the second section and the third section. And I think the section on colonialism, so I don't know if this is like, there's some kind of connection here, but Aimé Césaire actually, who was, I believe he was either a student of Frantz Fanon or he was friends with him or something like that. But he wrote about almost the exact kind of same thing in his discourse on colonialism, where he was talking about how the Holocaust was kind of the culmination of European colonization in Africa and Asia and other places. And that's pretty much the kind of idea that Arendt says in the second part of Origins, but she says it in a kind of much more offensive way at certain points.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, she does.
The third part of the book I do like, where she is talking about fascism. the difference between like nationalism and totalitarianism, and it's about the concentration camps as like experiments in like how far humans can go.
Yeah.
About holiness as like this ground of terror. I think is one of like the common quotes. But yeah, I think the third part of Origins is solidly good work. Um, I know there's also a lot of critique about Origins in terms of like the historical accuracy, but that's kind of an issue with a lot of her work in general. Eichmann too.
Yeah. And again, I mean, that's an okay criticism. I mean, I think it's not really fair though, because she's not trying to do historical work,
Right.
right? I don't think you should have like a blatant historical inaccuracies, but she's not writing history.
Yeah.
She's talking more thematically. So those criticisms are always like, yeah, I hear you, but it's a little, it's just not her focus. Surprisingly, I can't remember if it's in the second part or the first part. She has some really cool, not unintentionally, I think, but some really cool statements about like free speech and free thought, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think she does mention that in the third part, where she
Maybe,
talks
yeah,
about
maybe it's there too.
things like that. Maybe.
Yeah, it's which is really good. I think that some people, I think with the rise of kind of alt-right groups and Trump's presidency and other kind of right populists that around the world that have were popping up over the past 4 or 5 years. There was a resurgence of this book. I mean, it started selling more copies than it had, and in the past couple years. But I always feel like I don't like people that try to find something and kind of read the well, this is kind of an antiquated, I'm showing my age here, antiquated kind of example, that read like the front page newspaper and then read her stuff and try and see people do that with a lot of things. I don't think that's quite right. I think you can get some themes of it, right? And or hints of it, but I don't think that it's quite like that. How do you view that or think about that?
Yeah, I also think that's, like you said, it's not really in the spirit of her work even, to maybe be looking at like the newspaper and then be looking to Arendt for kind of a guide on how to handle totalitarianism in today's world or something. I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with even the concept of the like thinking without a banister that she mentions. She didn't use it in any of her works, but like she has this. She said that it was like a metaphor that she would use to kind of think through her own thoughts. And the idea of thinking without a banister is that these kind of like moral guardrails or, the moral or like kind of legal guardrails that used to kind of guide our thought are no longer there. They've kind of been exploded by the events of the 20th century, especially the Holocaust and these other kinds of horrible genocides and things. And so we kind of have to start thinking outside of the box in terms of how we're going to face the kind of challenges of the new world. And so just even thinking about that, I feel like it's not in the spirit of Arendt even to look to Arendt for some kind of guidance for today.
Yeah, it feels like people try to see her as like some kind of, prophetic something or other. And it's like, I think you can maybe see, like on the Origins, you can definitely see like the, like the early beginnings of some of that stuff. It's like, okay, sure, there's some similarities. Like, okay, we should probably be wary of this stuff. But I don't, people throw around labels too flippantly, I think, nowadays. And fascism isn't one of these that just, people don't know what the fuck they mean. It really gets under my skin where it's like, you don't know what that is. You don't know what it means because you looked it up in a dictionary. That doesn't mean you know what the concept of a movement or some type of political kinds of ideas that are associated with that.
Yeah.
And trying to just throw that word or attach it to something else in front of it or behind it is, I think, really irresponsible. And so it's just sort of the same thing with Hannah Arendt. I mean, she's trying to understand, again, the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, not, a little, one party that you don't like, 50, 60 years later. I think it's a little too much. We need to reserve those terms for really strong things when they happen. Right. Otherwise they lose their value and their meaning, I think.
Right.
So that's kind of always like my little frustration, I think, with people that try to read the newspaper and read Hannah Arendt. But nonetheless, I think the thing about it is that you can definitely see some themes. Like, hey, okay, like this kind of starts here. Like there are some kind of rhetoric or language that goes on. We should probably watch out for that. We should probably keep that in check. I think there's some value to it, but I think trying to use it as prescriptive is misguided.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree.
So I guess on that, because this will probably be I have two final points here. Is what is Eichmann in Jerusalem and her banality of evil, and then like how you understand it, and then how you read it, and then how that may set up for kind of the work you want to do with your dissertation and stuff. I'm sure you'll have to use some of her work and all that as well.
So Eichmann, I find the Eichmann trial really fascinating. So the Eichmann trial is Adolf Eichmann was the person who was in charge of the transports. So he was the one who was in charge of coming up the lists for which Jews were going to be put on which trains, going to which concentration camps. And so that was what he was in charge of. And he was he escaped after the war to Argentina. And there's even a movie about it now.
Ben Kingsley, I think, is Eichmann.
Yes. Yeah. And so like the Mossad agents from Israel basically came all the way to Argentina and were able to find him through some undercover kind of mission they had going on. And they brought him back to Israel for this trial. And it was kind of like the event of the century in a way and Hannah Arendt was there because she was covering it for the New Yorker. And so she was commissioned to cover it for the New Yorker. And her kind of take on it was that Eichmann was exhibiting this thing that that people call the banality of evil, or that is commonly referred to as banality of evil. And the idea is that you don't have to be monstrous or like horrible or demonic in order to be considered evil. It could just be this kind of evil can come from something as banal as a failure to think, a failure to kind of have imagination, to put yourself in the perspective of other people. And so Eichmann didn't do that. He didn't realize that he didn't put himself in the shoes of the people that he was transporting off to these camps. And then repeatedly throughout this trial, he would kind of contradict himself or like exaggerate what he did. And at one point he brings Kant in. He tries to defend himself, saying that he followed the categorical imperative. And at that point, Hannah Arendt is just like, even an intro level philosophy student has a better understanding of categorical imperative than Adolf Eichmann does.
Yeah, it's funny. Just for, I'm not a historian, just for some historical background. So obviously, there's Nazi Germany. And they basically had 3 stages for this. There's the first stage, second stage, and then there's the final solution, right? The final solution was concentration camps for Jews, and they were all put into hard labor, and then they finding creative, efficient ways of killing them, which is barbaric, and it's one of the worst things in our human existence, in our history. And so, like you're saying, Eichmann was in charge of basically rounding up Jews to put them in camps. And the controversy with Hannah Arendt is that so in the trial, you can watch footage of it online, I think. There's
the whole thing on YouTube.
Yeah.
Really to watch though, because they dub it in like some other language or something. It's like hours and hours of footage.
so just to also remind people that Israel became a state, meaning a country on its own, independent in 1949. So we're talking that, Israel had only been a country for
Not that,
12
like,
years.
yeah, exactly.
And, only less than 5 years since World War II ended. So, I mean, this was all very raw still. This is very fresh. Like the Israeli country was like, they wanted blood, right? They want, like, we need to get somebody's head on a spike here, proverbially. And like Eichmann is, primed for this. So there was that charge, and like, who can blame him? Like, of course, right? But there's a trial, which is, some people I think even resisted that. They're like, why are we trying this guy? Like, let's just kill him. Like he was just, or let him, torture him or whatever. Like he did horrible things. And other people are like, no, due process and stuff. But then with Hannah Arendt, Eichmann's whole thing was like a large part. He contradicted this in certain points, but his large defense was, he has a very, his demeanor was strange too. He's very apathetic if you watch it.
Yeah.
He has this very kind of like, meh, yeah, I did some things. Like it's just very cavalier.
Yeah.
Not in like a psychopath. He's not a psychopath. He doesn't come across that way. It's just very like, almost like it's totally missed on him why he's there. But his whole defense, or a big part of his defense, is I was just following orders, guys. Like, what do you want me to do? Like, you get this maniacal dude who's like a tyrant, who's killing everyone around the world, literally. I'm just following orders. I didn't like this stuff. Like, I just didn't think about it. Like, just following orders. And the crazy thing about it, Hannah Arendt like got serious heat for this, was Hannah kind of agreed with him, which was crazy. Not entirely, but she was like, she's like, he's too dumb of a person to really recognize really what he's doing or not doing. And the fact is that you can still do evil things, even if you're not able to recognize or think for yourself.
Right.
And so she didn't think he was this evil mastermind, psychopathic, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't think she entirely believed that he was just taking orders. Like, he's not he's not a dummy, but he just was in one sense. But in another sense, he kind of was just not that bright. Right. And her point is that, so that's the banal. But the point of it is that, yeah, but you can still do some evil shit, even if you don't know, or if you can't have empathy or take someone's perspective.
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's her point.
Yes.
That's more dangerous.
Yes.
Because when people aren't thinking, and this goes to her philosophy you were outlining earlier, the thinking and doing and all that, is if you're not actively engaged in that, if you're not actively engaged in thinking and being mindful of what you're doing, not by accident, although that could be possible too, but you could be doing things that are harmful. Yes. To other people or to yourself. Do I have a reading of that? Or
I think so. Yeah. I think the idea is that if you're not able to think for yourself, you're going to end up doing things that are just not acceptable. And the minute you kind of step in, I think she says this in the postscript of the book, or maybe it's in Responsibility and Judgment, but she says the minute that someone steps back and says, who am I to judge? Or who am I to like do anything about this, or like to think about this? That's kind of when you know you've like lost.
Yeah.
That when you stop taking that individual responsibility, that's when you know it's kind of just a lost cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything else I'm missing about like the because it was super controversial?
Yeah. So the other big thing about the Eichmann trial was that so there's one page of the book early on where she's talking about the Jewish councils, the Judenrat, ghettos, and she's basically talking about how they're complicit as well in what.
That's right. Yeah.
And so a bunch of Jewish groups, her old Jewish friends like Gershom Scholem and some of the other people, really not into the fact that she kind of brought this up at all.
And what was her argument? How are they complicit? I'm forgetting the argument. What was her argument about this?
Yeah, so I believe that the Judenrat is just like the name for like these communal Jewish councils, and they would be in the ghettos, and they were kind of forced to collaborate with the Nazi leaders. And they kind of knew like the fate of they knew like at a certain point that these people are going to be sent to Auschwitz or something. But in a lot of cases, they didn't tell the people that they're subsiding over. And there's a lot of controversy about, what kind of level of complicity they're at. But I think people were really outraged that, we're trying a Nazi. Why are you talking about why Jewish people are part of the problem? Like, why are you turning the victim into a person here? And I think there's a certain way in which the book, like my personal take on it is that she was right to kind of prescribe this banality of evil idea. I don't think she was necessarily right to apply to Eichmann.
Why?
Yeah, so like given kind of things that came out after the trial about Eichmann, like she had this idea that, Eichmann is not this like huge anti-Semite or something. But then I guess later it came out in these kind of like historical records in his notes and things like that he did kind of express these anti-Semitic opinions or ideas. And it seems like if that's true, then there's a kind of tension with the idea that he wasn't really thinking or that he didn't know the extent of things. But I think my main kind of issue, and not just mine, I think a lot of people's issue with this book is the tone. Sometimes she can take on a very like ironic or like, I don't know. The tone to me doesn't like fit the kind of subject matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this huge controversy came up with the question of the Judenrat, because she didn't treat it as carefully as she could have.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've read it a few times. It's not a very long book, and I've read it a few times, and that sticks out to me. Yeah, it does have a kind of, I don't want to say cavalier, but it has a very dissociative kind of aspect to it, right? Like she's talking about a thing,
right,
and not like recognizing that, again, this is one of the worst atrocities in human history.
Right.
Just talk about it very like kind of about it instead of like, this almost, 40,000 foot kind of, perspective kind of thing. It's like, wait a minute, come on now. Like this didn't happen. Like, we're not talking about Alexander the Great or something. We're talking about something that happened 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
And we got this dude in front of us who did a lot of these things. Yeah. And yeah, she was in such a strange position too, because at the time she's living in the United States, she was a refugee. Like she experienced this, but there was this, yeah, I mean, it does read as like the ultimate victim blaming. And my perspective on that is, I see her points and maybe there's some validity to them. Not the time to talk about it. That's another piece or something. Not the time to talk about that. Like I think the timing of it was really bad. And not
also an element of identity politics in play. I mean, like because she's a Jew herself, there's a question of like, well, the Jewish community kind of wants you to respond to this in a certain way, and when you're not kind of doing it in that way, people are really disappointed. And Deborah Lipstadt, so she, I'm sure you've heard of her, but Deborah Lipstadt is
I don't think so.
So she is an author who wrote about the Eichmann trial. Like she wrote about Arendt's coverage of the Eichmann trial in a book. But she's most famous for going up against David Irving in that kind of like, there was a court case in Britain, I think I don't know if it was a few years ago or like maybe a decade ago or so. It was a very famous court case where David Irving is a Holocaust denier. And so she kind of went up in court against him to kind of show that like, can't be saying these things in history books, saying that the Holocaust didn't happen or that this many Jews really weren't killed or whatever it is.
Right.
And so she has that kind of background. But the reason I bring her up is she has this very robust critique of Arendt in this book on the Eichmann trial, where she's saying that, Eichmann was kind of catering to two different, not Eichmann, Arendt was catering to two different aspects of her personality. There's a part of her that's Jewish, and she has these Jewish friends, and she wants to be very sympathetic to that. And she does think that Eichmann deserves to die. I mean, at the end of the book, she's saying, but then Deborah Lipstadt says there's also a part of Arendt that wanted to kind of appease the friend circle or the group the intellectual group that she had back in the U.S. Who were not Jewish, and people like Mary McCarthy or these other people who might have been more happy to see her criticize Israel and kind of offer this interpretation. But I'm not familiar with her, and I don't disagree with that. It does feel a little bit like she's kind of maybe just internally kind of pulled in two directions of like how she should have her tone or how she should do things. I do get that. Yeah. The question of Heidegger too.
Yeah. So, so the brief version of this is, oh man. So I'll tell you a funny story about this. So, I think I mentioned that I've taught some classes on existential humanistic theory and therapy. And I remember there's this one class, I think I've told this story before. There's this one class I had, and we would talk about Heidegger. I mean, we talk about the concepts and the themes like we did earlier in this conversation. So I brought, being in time, right? And I passed it around the class. This was when we were still meeting in person. And I've had my copy for a while, and so people are just kind of looking through it, whatever, and so I see a hand shoot up in the class, and I take the question. This student says, this looks like a dense book and whatever, and I was like, yeah, because it says here in the beginning of the book, right? I guess there's kind of like a small about the author or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, it says in the book, official member of the Nazi Party, and was banned from his teaching post from 45 to 51. And the student is like, can you explain this and why we're learning about it? And so I spent probably 20 to 30 minutes explaining, totally was not planned to explain this, make a defense of an actual Nazi.
Yeah.
So my first comment was, he wrote this in 1927. That was a very different time. I think I said something like, 3/4 of us would have voted for the National Socialist, whatever the party is. I'm forgetting the initials. 3/4 of us would have voted for that in 1933 or whatever. Like, you got to understand the Weimar Republic. You got to understand like how awful. Germany almost didn't exist as a country because of World War I and many other things. And so it was, a type of populism. That's what happens. And so I said, so he wrote it and published it before, the war, before Hitler came into power. I think Hitler was still like in prison or whatever in 1927. So, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party afterwards. And again, much more from a kind of a nationalistic kind of way of doing it, less than an ideological way. At least that's my reading of it. And I said, but even when you look at Heidegger's philosophy, he's just talking about ontology. There's nothing about groups of people, or there's nothing about like eugenics. There's nothing about like, there's just, it's straight down being, Dasein, worldhood, all the things we detailed before, even when you read later Heidegger, for the most part. And so what's interesting about this, the class mostly felt at ease after I explained, about why, yes, Heidegger is a Nazi, or was a Nazi, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't read his thought, philosophical thought. And he didn't really write political or social thought. So that's the difference. And, and all of this was kind of a precursor to his joining the party in World War II. But, that said, I mean, it's still a off-putting thing. And so kind of you had mentioned it earlier that Hannah Arendt was a student of Heidegger in her, I guess, doctorate program, and she studies, and he was married, and I think she was married, or she was engaged, or she was with somebody.
Yeah,
and
she was with Gunther Stern, but that was after she had an affair with Heidegger.
Yeah, so I think Hannah it literally is like, if you, I guess the modern day piece of it would be like, I guess it sounds terrible to say, but it's like if you have a student that is with their, like, not just like a teacher or something, it was like her advisor and like mentor and all this stuff, and like
reciting poetry to each other, like they loved Holderlin, I think.
Yeah, that's right. They wrote letters to each other, and like he was married, and so it was like, and they had a physical relationship, and then it stopped. My reading of it is, I think they really liked each other, obviously, but they, like, academically and intellectually, and it kind of grew. It just kind of grew in how they expressed it in other ways. And, people can have their opinions about the morality of it and the judgment of it. Okay, that's fair. But so that did happen. But I'm saying that because, so they stopped correspondence. She got married. They, and they talked again later in life, but it doesn't seem like they like rekindled anything, I don't think. But so how does a German Jewish woman who was put in a camp and then left her country as a refugee, came to the United States, she must have been absolutely beside herself to know that her mentor and, lover and all this stuff was part of the Nazi party and all these things. And typical Hannah form, surprised everybody and defended him, absolutely defended him. What is your reading of her defense of him? Most people don't like her defense, but how do you understand her defense of Heidegger, of being part of a Nazi party and stuff?
I'm actually quite sympathetic to her. I think it's a very, very hard position to be in. And I don't think it's so easy to say. I mean, like you said, this is someone who shaped her thought. And I mean, Heidegger shaped a generation of philosophy.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Not just philosophy, like entire disciplines worth of thought.
Oh yeah.
But to have this person be your personal mentor, and someone who really influenced you, and the ideas that you can see in the human condition or these other things.
Oh yeah.
I think they're responses to Heidegger. So in a way, yeah, I'm very sympathetic in terms of the kind of emotional response that she must have. But I think, again, there's this idea, there's this expectation that she's not going to forgive him, or that she shouldn't forgive him because of his Nazism. And I think my personal reading of her is that I think she went back and forth on it.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's certain earlier, like when she first came to the US, I think there are like earlier pieces that she's written where she really tears into him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the exact piece, but I think it's either a letter to De Gaspers or like maybe it's a piece that she wrote publicly. I can't remember what exactly it is. But in that piece, she's just tearing into him for how he treated Husserl. And then basically he says something along the lines of, "You're a murderer. You killed Husserl. You got the dedication to Husserl and being in time. You got him expelled from the University of Freiburg and got his library privileges revoked. And this is how you thank the person who gave you the spot in the first place, the rectorship and all of that." So, I mean, I think
Husserl was also Jewish, right? That's right.
Yeah. So I think she was really mad. And then later, I mean, she writes this like, what is it called? she writes like a tribute to him, a letter to Heidegger on his 80th birthday or something like that. So it's very complicated. Like they had a very rough relationship, and then Elfriede comes into it as well. Heidegger really wanted Arendt and Elfriede to be friends or to like reconcile, and so Elfriede is his wife, right? And that just was a horrible idea on his part.
Yeah, but, he should have stuck with the ontology, but yeah, his interpersonal dynamics are maybe not the most. It should be, and I have to think this is intentional, but so yeah, he lived to like his 80s.
Yeah, he died after her, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, because she died in 76.
69, right? No,
Heidegger died in 76. And yeah, I think she died in the 60s. That's right.
In 69, right?
That sounds right.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, Heidegger lived the last
she lived longer than I thought.
2 decades.
In 675. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess they died close together, but he lived like much of his last like decade or two pretty much in isolation.
Yeah.
I mean, he was in the Black Forest in Germany, I think with his wife.
Yes.
But he never really went out. He just, I don't know if you know this. Do you know Terrence Malick?
I've heard of him. Is he the director?
So Terrence Malick did oh my God. He did The Thin Red Line. He did is it Badlands? Is it he did Tree of Life is the big one.
Okay.
New World. He's Terry Malick has done, I think, 8 films in 40 years. He's very notorious for like taking like an hour and a half takes, long shot, and editing his movies in post for like 3 years. Like, no, not even exaggerating, like just editing and, And so there's this really cool story about Malick where he's old. He's old now. And I think he's in his 70s. And he was studying, I forgot where he was studying. Was it in England? I don't remember. Maybe it was in Germany. I don't remember. And he was doing philosophy. And he translated one of Heidegger's works into English. And and he wanted to write, I'm going to get this wrong. He wanted to write his dissertation. He was almost done. He wanted to write his dissertation on Heidegger's idea of the world or worldhood and I can't remember. He was trying to combine like 2 other thinkers. Maybe it was Nietzsche, but he was trying to combine 2 other thinkers' major thoughts. And like his committee was like, "You're insane. Like, you're never going to write this. This is way too difficult. And you can't do that." And they just were like, "No." So he was like, "Well, forget you guys." So he drops out, and he's also kind of not an invalid, but he's very solitary. He doesn't do interviews. His movies comes out. You never see him. You never hear him.
Yeah.
He's this like mystique to him. But if you watch every single one of his movies, so the 8 or 9 he's done, all of them, I mean, they're beautiful films. All of them, he's doing some aspect of Heidegger's philosophy. Like that's literally, he's doing philosophy in film. And he's doing Heidegger's philosophy in film, specifically worldhood. And how do you exist in the world?
I've never seen anything. I've never seen any of his movies. So
I mean, they're tremendous. I can watch any of his films any day of the week. Like they're amazing. But if you watch The New World, it's a period piece. It's about people coming, John Smith and coming to New World and Pocahontas. Yeah. But how he talks about that kind of like these primordial kinds of like origins about being in the world. And of course, cinematography is huge for him. It's an amazing film. The extended edition is really good. The Thin Red Line, it's a war film, but how do you understand your place in the world of war, and how you're dealing with death and all these things. I mean, beautiful films. But Tree of Life, I think, is probably his best. And, they're non-linear, they don't work, start, middle, end, it's very much, kind of an experience. So you don't treat it that way. But Tree of Life I think it's one of our best films of the 21st century. It's such a great film where he's talking about Heidegger's notions of world in like 2 or 3 different dimensions. Like he'll use shots from space, literally, and then he'll use through time in a developmental period. It's a beautiful film. It's a beautiful film. But interestingly enough, before Heidegger died, he was very young and in school. He met with Heidegger himself in the Black Forest, went to his like cabin or whatever, was there for like 2 or 3 days. He's never spoken about it. He says he'll never speak about it. It's between him and Heidegger. But it's really cool to think that, he went, he talked to him for hours and hours, stayed there for a couple of days, and, I guess got enough to then, now he makes Hollywood films talking about Heidegger's philosophy. They're great. You would love it. You should watch all his films. They're amazing.
I'll watch them. Yeah.
They're amazing. Okay. So last question here, since we've been going at it for a while, it's kind of the big question I think that everybody has for a lot of this stuff is, okay, I think some people can get some of this stuff and say, like, I get it. I can see some of it. But for you, with Hannah Arendt and with Heidegger and, maybe just continental philosophy in general or philosophy in general. But with these two thinkers specifically, what's the point? So what? Who cares? Why should we study this? Why should we know this? Why should we waste time thinking about it and talking about it? For you, what's the kind of practical or applied sense of this stuff and why it's important for today in 2021 almost?
I actually think this is one of the harder questions.
Yeah, it is. It is really hard.
Questions.
You can just, riff on it. Just what comes to the top of your head. You don't need like a whole formulated answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what interests me most about Arendt, especially, is I think she just has such an incredible life that really that just interests me so much.
Yeah.
To have all these different experiences and then to be able to kind of put it down in words and contribute to the philosophical canon in some way, that's just like very like moving to me. That she was able to kind of integrate all these different things and come up with this philosophy that's like very relevant. I mean, even if we talked earlier about like we don't want to just apply it and that's maybe misguided. But I think there's a lot of insights in Arendt and Heidegger for new ways that we can think about things. Yeah.
Yeah. Any ideas about what new ways we could, or specifically, if you know? It's fine if you don't, but.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I do like about Arendt is this focus on the world. So she has that quote in The Human Condition where she says that we're all like, the world is like the table that gathers us all together.
Yeah.
It's this very famous quote where it's about how the table as the world is kind of the thing that in between, the thing that kind of separates and relates us at the same time.
Right.
And the more and more that modernity kind of progresses and technology becomes more of a factor, and that's an aspect of Heidegger as well, later Heidegger.
Yep.
But the more that these kind of things happen, it seems like the world is disappearing, or that public realm is kind of not becoming as important, or we're neglecting it in a certain way, or not giving it the kind of importance that it deserves.
Right.
And I really like that, I guess, that move to... What I like about Arendt is I feel like she doesn't just sit in her armchair.
Yeah.
There there's a way in which this philosophy is really applicable to like you need to show care for the world. You need to actually be involved in things. This focus on thinking is important, but there's also this element of action. And a lot of philosophers have just sat there and thought about, I don't know, the essence or existence distinction or like dualism or something. And it's just not really, it's not applicable to everyday life. But there's a sense in which this is like Arendt is giving us an attitude with this kind of idea of a morality, of us trying to take on the world and care for it as people who live in it.
I totally agree about that. I think this is in Heidegger. Is it painful to read and get through, and you got to do it a bunch of times. But once you get it, it's like, whoa, it's really powerful. And I think it's very similar. That's why he talks about very practical things. I mean, most of Heidegger's time was spent with the common folk. That's why he talks about hammers and tools and, nails and, different things like that. And I like his stuff on present at hand and readiness to hand and all that. But with Hannah, she has this, you're absolutely right. That's a great way of saying it. She has this attitude of things of like, don't just sit around and think about this stuff, armchair philosophers or things like that. Like, go and do something, create, find the potential, find the meaning.
Right.
And it's a very doing thing. And it's a very, as you're a participant of the world, not just an observer.
Yeah.
And I think that's easy for people to get her stuff because of how she writes. She writes less, painfully as, Kant or Hegel or Heidegger. And so it's a little more accessible in that way, but doesn't lose the profound thinking of it.
Yeah.
But it feels purposeful. And that's not to say the other guys don't have purpose, but it's a very nice, we talked about tone with Eichmann. That's a different kind of thing. It's a very topical kind of thing, but her other Human Condition, I think Life of the Mind does that a little bit, where she has a nice tone and tries to, she's trying to, I think that's right. She's trying to promote an attitude of life. And that's, I don't know, it feels very concrete, but also very, with room to maneuver. And, so, I agree. I'd agree with you. I think, this stuff is really important because we're talking about humans and we're talking about what it means to be and how we exist in our world around us. And we do and think about those things already, even though we don't realize it. And I think taking time to consider all the way down to fundamental principles has place and it has utility. And then using that as a springboard to say, how do we construct ways in which we want to live in the world, how we want to interact with other people, and find creation and find value in things in all aspects of life is, I think, the power of their thought and their ways of thinking and how it influences us and how we'll continue to we need to have those types of understandings of things as we progress further in a 21st century that is being met with very novel challenges of social media, digital media, artificial intelligence, the technological ages. We're going to, and Heidegger talked about this, some of the stuff later in his life, that those are the, that's the new landscape and the new horizons that we're going to need to have debates about. And if we don't get some of the stuff or understand some of the hard work they did before they had to think about these things, we'll be in big trouble. And so I think there's a kind of what's coming down to us or what's coming upon us as we move forward in the future and through time. It seems like it's going to be a lot of those kinds of conversations. So we better have these principles of being in the world and space and thinking and doing and being very active and unveiling and creating. We need to know, I think, all of those things well, so we can be better for how the human race progresses in time.
I think maybe it's best captured in I think the end of the preface of The Human Condition, where she says the task is to think what we are doing. So there's that. And I feel like even though she criticizes Marx, there's maybe like a kind of echo of his like very famous quote from Theses on Feuerbach, where he saes, philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world. The point is to change it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, I have kept you here long enough. It was quite a joy to talk to you.
Yeah, great.
I follow you online. I love all the things you say, and I think you have a really sharp mind. It's so encouraging to see someone like yourself with your ideas and your presentation, and then also your youthfulness and all the particulars in your background and your whole story, to be doing something like studying philosophy and trying to really understand it and really get at that. It's such an encouraging thing to see. So I'm quite fortunate to have got your 3 hours or whatever to talk about stuff that I like to think about and find the applied aspects of it and hear your positions and your feelings and thoughts about it. It's been very, very, very nice, and I hope for listeners as well. It's been very nice to hear.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yes, of course, and you're always welcome here.
Yeah, thank you.